Hello, hello. All right, I just unmuted you guys for a moment while we all get in here. All right, how you guys doing?
Good. We just had Nathan's yoga class. It was awesome.
Oh,
You
was
should
it?
go
Yeah,
get some
I was.
stuff.
I
Yeah.
was prepping some stuff. I want to go try that out.
Yeah,
I'm curious
really
who's
good.
recording those, so I'd
I
like to
don't
watch
know.
them after the fact.
Hey, Sifu.
I don't
Hello,
know.
hello.
Isifu.
Get some
Hey
water.
guys, wow, look at Marlon looking like a serial killer.
Oh my God. What is that about? What's with the glasses there, buddy? Look at that weaponry.
Crazy, crazy. Someone's scarier and scarier. All right.
See what I can do for next weekend.
Yeah, we'll just wait a few more minutes. Gonna let a few other people come in here. I have a hopefully interesting topic for you guys today.
Ooh.
And of course, in addition to going over this topic, if you guys have questions, we can always turn the Saturday theoretical portion into a Q&A as well. So what I'll do is I'll do the theoretical portion first, and then we can discuss it. And then, of course, if you guys have questions, you can ask. So I'll kind of get through the topic first, and then we can do kind of chat at the end. Letting some people come here. So I see we got Andrew, got Nicole's wall, Christina, nice. Alejandro's here, Marlon looking like a serial killer, Edwin in the house, rocking the hardcore mustache, Antonio. We got Pai Mei, Mikey Dean, Alan Horton, Dre, Ed, who else we got here? Kess and Paul. All right, nice.
You.
Just wait a few more minutes. Another minute. Still figuring out how to make the movie thing work. I tried streaming, like doing the share screen thing, but sometimes when you do it through iTunes, like Zoom doesn't let you share the screen because it knows that you're trying to share a movie or something like that. So I have to figure out exactly how to do that.
Gotcha.
It should be fun. Yeah, we should have some kind of movie night tonight. We'll send out the link and the time. Don't do it through iTunes. Yes, but I have the movie on iTunes, so I'm going to have to figure out another way.
Oh.
I'll figure it out. Well, for those of you who might have some experience with that, I'll talk to you guys after the fact. Because although I put those 3 recommendations, a number of people wanted to see 8 Diagram Pole Fighter, and I got 8 Diagram Pole Fighter through iTunes, but now I cannot share it, which is like, ugh. So I was thinking of low-tech solutions, like I could put my phone on a tripod, film it through there, and stream it, but we'll figure out another way. Mikey Dean seems to know what's up.
He's the man with the AV plan.
That's right. All right, cool. So I'm going to go ahead and mute you guys, and we'll get started. So if you have anything to say or contribute or ask, then just use the chat, all right? All right, thumbs up if you guys can hear me. All right, okay, fantastic. All right, so today what I wanted to talk about a little bit were about the kicking techniques we have in Wing Chun and how this compares to some of the other Chinese martial arts and why we do the kicking the way we do. Because there's this kind of, not a stigma, but almost kind of like a feeling that, oh, Wing Chun only uses low kicks, but the other Kung Fu styles have all these high kicks and jumping kicks and all this kind of crazy stuff. And I actually want to dispel that as a bit of a myth. First of all, as much as we love to talk about how Wing Chun is different from the other Chinese martial arts. I mean, we do Wing Chun because there's a certain practicality to it, a certain directness to it, while at the same time being a cool martial art. But definitely part of the appeal of Wing Chun is that we don't have all these jumps and rolls and flips and shouting and all this kind of crazy stuff. It's a kind of a very straightforward, very practical, very real world martial art. But that also kind of becomes a bit of an issue in terms of narratives, because sometimes Wing Chun people have the idea that, oh, we're the only style that does that, and all the other styles are jumping around and rolling around and doing nonsense, and we're the only people that kick low and kick straight and do things in a kind of practical way. And this is actually a misconception, and this is based slightly on some problems within the history of Chinese martial arts. So last week I made a YouTube video for you guys, just for you students here, which is actually a Dudes of Kung Fu Patreon supporter only thing. So don't share that link, because other people have to pay to listen to me talk about that. You guys as students of City Wing Chun get that for free through the YouTube link, where I discuss kind of the early history of Wing Chun, kind of not so much directly how Wing Chun was developed, but the time period in which Wing Chun was developed, so that we can kind of have a little bit of an idea where, what might be myth and what might be true. But what I didn't talk about that much in that kind of historical narrative was the early 20th century, because I kind of went up to that point and kind of ended it there. The early 20th century in China, also known as the Republic period, which is the period between the Qing dynasty, which was the final dynasty of China, and essentially the Communist Party taking over in 1949. In between then, you had this kind of what's known as the Republic era. And this was like almost the whole world at that time, very tumultuous and very turbulent time in China's history. And this also included changing perceptions to Chinese martial arts. Now, what a lot of people don't understand, because we always think about Chinese martial arts as being something that's very revered by the Chinese people, by the beginning of the 20th century, okay, so we're looking at the early 1900s, the perception among the common Chinese people is that they actually hated Chinese martial arts, and they hated Chinese martial artists, because there were two kind of common, let's say, public relations problems with Chinese martial arts. Okay, one, there was a perception that Chinese martial arts, and this perception grew even later, even into more modern Hong Kong, that Chinese martial arts were essentially only practiced by gangsters, people who were thugs and rebels and trying to fight the government and all that kind of stuff. So there was a reputation that Chinese martial artists were a bit unsavory, okay? And the second problem was there was something called the Boxer Rebellion, which many people may have heard of. And the Boxer Rebellion is essentially when, the narrative is that it was Chinese Kung Fu versus Western guns. And you could probably guess who won that exchange, right? So, but that is also another problem of kind of how history has skewed the narrative a little bit. Of course, in the late Qing dynasty, when you had lots of foreign invaders coming into China, especially from Europe, and overpowering with their guns, and then you had the Opium Wars, and you had the Taiping Rebellion, and you had all of these kind of, like, China was just all over the place from foreign invaders coming in and kind of trying to take a piece of it. There was a group of boxers, and remember, Chinese martial arts were called boxing by Westerners because the British had boxing, and they had no other way to describe what they saw Chinese people practicing. When they saw Chinese martial arts, they didn't know the term Kung Fu. The term martial arts wasn't something that was used. So that's the reason why the British called what they saw, when they saw Kung Fu, they called it boxing. So this term of Chinese boxing came from the Westerners because they didn't know what to call it. The term martial arts were not in vogue yet, right? So that's why sometimes you hear things called Chinese boxing, right? And this is essentially the term for martial arts before martial arts. So just to give you a little bit of context there. So there was something called the Boxer Rebellion. And the Boxer Rebellion was a group called the Yiwo Tun, which were essentially almost like they were a cult, okay? So these were not mainstream Chinese martial artists. These weren't people who like practiced Wing Chun and Hong Kong and practical martial arts. These were people who had an irrational belief that if they practice a certain type of qigong and breathing and they could build up their body, that they could withstand foreign bullets, which is completely insane, right? But of course, they had this extremely irrational belief. And they were kind of like a group that was growing and spreading throughout China. And they eventually had a number of standoffs with Western guns, and they lost. So because of the kind of, some martial artists might have been thugs or unsavory people, And the rest of them are associated with being these idiots who believe that they could withstand guns, and then essentially were all gunned down and killed. By the early 20th century, the reputation of Chinese martial arts was extremely low. All right. The only way martial arts survived were, you know, as I discussed in the advanced theoretical portion, where, you know, wealthy fathers wanted their sons to learn martial arts so they could develop a strong body, something called Keung San. Keung San means to make your body strong. And they would hire these sifus to teach their sons martial arts so that they would be strong, and then they would also be well-read. The idea of a well-rounded Confucian scholar is someone who is not just educated, but is also able to protect themselves, physically fit, had skills like martial arts and archery. All of these kind of skills were what were required to be a strong Confucian citizen in those times. So martial arts kind of survived in those pockets. And that's how some of these styles sustain themselves throughout this time. They were taught, the sifus would essentially be hired by rich dads to teach their sons, and that's kind of how these styles survived. But it's also the reason why these styles changed, because they went from a time period where the martial arts were being used to really fight and to really protect oneself. And then once this time period was gone, when martial arts were no longer a necessity for survival, then what do martial arts become? They become a habit. They become a hobby, right? So it's not that much different nowadays. Of course, special ops or military or bouncers or security, and obviously professional fighters, nowadays they need to learn martial arts because they're actually using it. But for like 99.9% of the people who practice martial arts, it's a hobby. It's something that, you know, has multiple benefits, and we do it for multiple reasons. The least of which might be because we need to physically fight every single day, right? So when this transition happened from martial arts being this necessity for survival, and it became essentially a hobby, then that's when Chinese martial arts, in my opinion, became a little bit more about the show and the presentation and the movement, and became less about how do you actually use this thing in fighting when someone's trying to hurt you, right? And this is the reason why during the early 20th century, a lot of martial arts styles, Chinese martial arts styles, started to add more forms and started to add higher kicks and things that looked a little bit more kind of visually artistic. And they started to move away from the, why do we have this movement in the form? How do we use this movement in the form? And the conversation started to go towards, did you learn all the forms? Did you learn the entire system from your sifu? Did your sifu teach you this version, that version, this version? And then Chinese martial arts almost became more about a collection of a physical, like a library of forms and movements, rather than it being an expression of combat. Now, there were a few styles that kind of stayed under that radar and avoided that. Wing Chun, in my opinion, was one of them, because Wing Chun, if you look at the family tree of Wing Chun, it's kind of like a straight line, right? The joke is always, it's like a redneck family tree, right? It's just a straight line, right? Because most sifu would teach like one or two students, or they would teach their son, who would teach one or two people. You know, Leung Jan taught a few people, Chan Ma Chun. But basically, if you look at the family tree, it goes like this. There were not a lot of branches really until the time of Grandmaster Yip Man and a few other people, but it was kind of a straight line until it went out this way. So that's why Wing Chun retained the traditional aspects of, we learn the form, but then we also teach you how to use this in fighting, instead of going, okay, you learn the Siunum Tao, like in a traditional Chinese martial art, now it would be like you learn the Siunum Tao. Once you can do that, we go, okay, now we're going to show you the Chum Kyu. Once you do that, okay, now we're going to show you this axe fist form. Okay, now I'm going to show you this double sword form. Now I'm going to show you this. And all the time you haven't learned even how to use the first form you learned in fighting. You're just starting to collect form on top of form on top of form. And this is essentially what happened to Chinese martial arts, where you see these guys have pretty forms, but as you know, the Wu-Tang Clan's RZA said, they couldn't fight their way out of a wet paper bag with scissors in their hands, okay? So, but they can sure do lots of cool looking stuff, right? But Wing Chun, because we always had chi sao, we always had some kind of sparring and some kind of way of actually practicing the stuff we were learning in the forms, we kept this through line of also using practical application as a measure of how good you are in Wing Chun, and not just how many forms you know, right? So this brings us to kicking. All right. So there's a perception of, and there's a very famous saying. In fact, most Chinese people who don't even do martial arts can even tell you this. And that saying is, and I'm going to write it in the chats here. All right. This is Nam Kun Bak To. Okay, so I just wrote in the chats, it's Lam Kun Bak To. Lam Kun Bak To means southern fists, northern kicks. All right. So that means that, like, in the world of Chinese martial arts, most Chinese martial artists say, okay, the southern styles use mostly fists and the northern styles use mostly kicks. So the northern styles are known for all the fancy kicks and the southern styles are known for their powerful punches. But of course, you know, the moment you and this is the same, not just in martial arts, but in your own life or in politics or in anything, the moment you start to get into this binary thinking, where it's like you are either this or you're either that, then that's already a problem. Because as we know, nothing is ever that black and white. There is a lot of gray area. There are even some southern styles that have some high kicks, and there's some northern styles that don't have high kicks, and some northern styles that have lots of hand techniques, for example, not just kicking. So we always need to be a little mindful when we start to hear these kind of very binary quotes. All northern styles are this, all southern styles are this. Because you can easily, when you have hundreds of different Kung Fu styles, pick exceptions from both sides. And then, so you always have to be very careful about these kind of narratives, right? So, but truthfully, most traditional martial arts, the ones that really were used for fighting, which was all of them before they became kind of hobbies in the early 20th century, they actually all used low kicks. Because if you really have to fight, a low kick, all right, whether to the leg or to the waist, is a lot more practical than trying to kick high and then you get run over and you fall down. And when some fist fighting martial arts were used on the battlefield, you have your weapons, and if your opponent was able to get past your weapon or throw your weapon, then you had to use your fist fighting. Well, the last thing you're going to do on a battlefield full of people with weapons is throw a high kick and potentially fall down and then get axed to death by a bunch of other people. So traditional real fighting martial arts use low kicks. They're just more practical. And it doesn't matter if you're a highly trained athlete and you can hold your leg up vertical. Even if you have that skill, that just means you're good in kicking. But if you really have to fight, you're not necessarily going to use that, right? So we think in martial arts as our flexibility, our range of motion as a gas tank, all right? And if you can go fully vertical and do a split, you have as full of a gas tank as possible. But you don't want to be always stepping on the gas in a real fight. You always want to have reserve, right? If you can kick all the way above your head, then your mid-level kicks and your low kicks would be absolutely killers, because there's no impingement in the movement, because it's not taxing your mobility at all. So we want to view range of motion and flexibility as a gas tank, right? And not something that means, okay, well, I can kick high now, I'm going to try to do a spinning kick every time my opponent attacks me. If we look at other Chinese martial arts, all right, also practical martial arts, for example, Hong Kong, right, which is another Southern style, you will see, and I'll put this up to the screen, that they also use low kicks to the groin. All right, he's not jumping around and flipping and throwing high kicks, because this is what people actually use. And Bruce Lee, who, you know, always took lots of notes. I have a copy here of, this is one of the pages. So Bruce Lee used to take photos. These are actually photos of him and Yip Man. He would take them, cut them out, and then write little notes. And he would make these little scrapbooks, right? Because this is Bruce Lee's handwriting up here. And this was the Eagle Claw style. Now, the Eagle Claw style does have some high kicks. You see that there. The Eagle Claw style is also a quote-unquote northern style, right? And I'm going to explain that in a moment. But one of the things I like about this is that Bruce actually has a photo of Yip Man kicking him. And it's very rare to see Yip Man doing a kick, and much more rare to see him doing it on someone. I will show you right here. It's a very small photo. You can see Yip Man is holding on to Bruce Lee's hands, and he's giving him a kick right to the sack right there. And if you look underneath, it says, talking about the straight thrust kick by Professor Yip. And this is Bruce Lee's handwriting right here, all right? Now remember, he calls him professor because at that time, using Chinese terms in English like sifu, now we always say sifu, right? People know what it means. But in the 50s and 60s, people didn't even know sensei from karate. So he tried to find an English equivalent to sifu, and he used professor. So he called, you know, when he wrote, they wrote Professor Yip, right? But that's just his way of somehow translating sifu into something workable in English, right? So the perception of Chinese kicks, all right, and I'll show you guys one more photo here from an old manual. So we're looking at, I'll show you an old manual photo, and then I will show you so this is like old school, and there you see, and this is not, for martial arts standards, a very high kick. All right, this is like, you know, about waist, a little bit higher. And when you look at the old school photos of people actually practicing, look, all right, I mean, those are the kicks. I mean, if you're going to kick someone in a real fight, you're not going to try to jump around and spin. And there's not that there's any, you know, as Seinfeld would always say, not that there's anything wrong with that, right? If you have the ability to do it, by all means. It's just a question of, for example, I have a black belt in Taekwondo, so I still practice all my high kicks. I do it so that when I spar with you guys, I can be a holy terror and give you guys roundhouse kicks and spin kicks, and you guys can really try your best. Those of you who practice against me know I put the leg up there slowly and tap your face with it, right? And everyone's like, right? So I still keep those kicks up. I keep the practice up mainly so I can help you guys get better at defending kicks. So there's nothing wrong with having the ability to do it. The question is what we're going to apply when someone is standing in front of us and they're screaming at us. What kind of kick is going to stop someone from coming at you? If you look at the Wing Chun kicks, they're essentially all made to stop a rushing opponent. All right, that's why they're all thrusting kicks, because you're essentially putting a barrier with your foot and leg between you and what we assume would be a rushing opponent. When you look at, for example, a roundhouse kick, which comes around the side and kind of hits either to the head or to the body, or nowadays was very common to the leg, right? Of course, high-level athletes, high-level MMA guys, if they give you one low kick, you're probably going to be sitting down and you're going to be like, all right, I'm done. But for the most part, when you see those guys fighting and throwing kick after kick after kick low, these guys can withstand it, because those are not kicks meant to stop someone from rushing you. These are kicks of attrition, meaning that over time, you're, you know, as they like to say in MMA, you're chopping down that front leg, or you're chopping down the inside leg to make their movements less explosive. But this is a tactic you can use when you're ring fighting, meaning you know you have 15 minutes to fight this person over 3 5-minute rounds. So it's a tactic. This guy's very explosive. So how do I keep this guy from being less explosive? I'm going to wear down that leg with low kick after low kick after low kick. And then, you know, by the third round, he's limping and he's not very fast. And then I can go in and punch. Well, these are ring tactics, and these are very smart ring tactics, but these are not necessarily applicable when you're walking down the street and somebody just grabs at you like this and tries to punch you, and then you're not going to go, okay, I need to move back and wear down this front leg over the course of the next 12 minutes so I have 3 minutes to unload my gas tank, right? This is why sometimes we cannot always look at ring sports, even though they're full contact and they're very real. We can learn a lot from them, but the tactics of a ring sport, when you have multiple rounds to fight, is not the same as when someone comes at you. So if someone comes at you, if they're rushing you and you throw a kick that goes around, there's nothing stopping them from still coming in. In fact, that's how we defend a round kick. We go straight in, right? So if we put this one in their face as they come in, then we create a barrier from them. And even if it doesn't knock them back or knock them down, it stops them and gives us a chance to do this without getting run over. The side kick is absolutely the same. It just does it from this angle here. And then the slant kick from that angle there. But these are always like posts. All right, like I always say, like the New Hope in the old Star Wars, right? When they're in the trash compactor and that thing is going like this, what do? They put that big bar on the side to kind of hold it. And I go, okay, that's one of the ways we use the Wing Chun kick. We can knock someone down with a Wing Chun kick, absolutely. We can knock the wind out of them. We can break their ribs. If you kick the knee, you can cause damage. But at the very least, the Wing Chun kick does that thing that they did in Star Wars with the compactor. It will at least stop something from coming in. So that's kind of on the spectrum. If we look at what our Wing Chun kicks can do, at the best, they can knock someone down, knock someone out, or cause massive injury. And at the worst, provided they're still done correctly, they stop somebody momentarily from rushing at you. If you have a very good kick and a very good stance, and that buys us some time to stop them and then to go in and do our strategy. So this is the reason why the selection of kicks in Wing Chun is not random. And it's not a stylistic thing. Oh, Wing Chun kicks with the heel because Wing Chun. Why does Wing Chun do this kick and not the roundhouse kick? Because Wing Chun, right? But most people kind of think that because they're used to justifying things as, especially in Kung Fu, purely as being stylistic as opposed to being functional. Well, Wing Chun is still a practical style that's based on function and not based on, because it looks cool and because we're imitating the movements of a mantis or we're imitating the movements of this thing. We're just trying to do what works regardless of what it looks like, right? So to kind of wrap it up in terms of the historical context, what happened in the early 20th century where martial arts, Chinese martial arts essentially became a hobby, there was one other thing that caused this bigger divide between Northern and Southern styles. So, by the way, Northern and Southern styles are so-called divided by whether they are north or south of the Yellow River, all right, or the Yangtze River, right? So basically, everything from Shanghai down is a Southern style, and everything from Shanghai up is a Northern style, which is ridiculous because this is such an arbitrary division in terms of like where styles come from. So if a style is created right on the border, what is it? Is there really, I mean, it's kind of ridiculous. And these are narratives that came out of the early 20th century. It's been theorized by some very well-respected Chinese martial arts researchers. And they, for example, Brian Kennedy, who's someone I love his books. He actually said that if you could go back in time and ask a Chinese martial artist from, let's say the 18th century, and you could communicate with them and you could say, the style of Kung Fu that you do, is it a Northern or Southern style? He believes that they would look at you and they would not understand what that question meant. Because most people, when they learn Kung Fu, they would say, I learned this Kung Fu from my uncle. I learned this Kung Fu from my Sifu. I don't know. My Sifu says it's 2 generations old. I don't know if it's North or South. I just learned it from my Sifu. Because most people who practice martial arts are not historians. So that means like 100, 200 years ago, you wouldn't have all these factions of, oh, I'm doing a Northern style, or my style is this, or my style is internal or external. All of these dichotomies, internal and external, North and South, hard and soft, right? These are essentially marketing terms that were developed in the early 20th century when Sifus had to make a living teaching these rich kids because their fathers wanted them to learn martial arts. So of course, if the Sifu said, yeah, this is the best style for fighting, well, the father really wants his son to become a gentleman. So the Sifu would say, I teach a Taoist style, which will help your son harmonize his internals and be able to handle all of life's difficult, and then suddenly this style is repackaged as something Taoist, or this is a Buddhist style and he will learn to be calm and meditate and all these kind of things, right? Or this is a hard style which will teach your son, like if the son was kind of weak, right? There's a hard style to teach your son to be strong. If the son was already kind of strong, there's an internal style to teach your son to relax. So all of these kind of divisions were actually created, believe it or not, for marketing reasons. Because if you went back 100, 200 years, they only cared if it worked or not. They didn't care internal, external, north, south, whatever. There's all these fights for these terms are kind of new school when you look over the broad history of Chinese martial arts. And the last part I want to kind of discuss here before we'll take some questions is, in the early 20th century, I believe in like 1909, there was an academy formed. And this was the first public Chinese martial arts school ever. Most Chinese martial arts schools were informal up until that point, or they were just a Sifu teaching some students somewhere, right? The first real professional Chinese martial arts school was in Shanghai, and it was called the Jingwu Academy. And the Jingwu Academy was a marketing concept by these 2 guys. And they decided to create a Chinese martial arts school that wouldn't be based on any one particular style. What they would do is they would have a bunch of different Sifus from different styles come in, And they also did things, for example, like they taught Western bodybuilding, which for Chinese people was like very exotic, right? And they even taught like gymnastics. And it was essentially a physical culture school. So it was like martial arts and gymnastics and bodybuilding and all of this kind of stuff. And it was partially done because after the Qing dynasty, after the Republican era started, the Chinese morale was very low, especially because the Japanese had already occupied them once. So the morale of the Chinese people was very low. They felt that although they were a great and vast country, they are constantly being plundered from outside countries, and they feel like they can't even protect their own country, right? With this long, rich history, the longest written records of any country, all this technology, and suddenly they're being trounced by all these foreign invaders. So the Chinese people felt kind of low. So the Jingwu Academy was actually partially to build up the youth in China, to make them feel strong again, physically strong, to kind of empower them. So the original motivations were really strong. But what happened was they created a curriculum, a foundational Chinese Kung Fu curriculum of new forms. And all people who came to the Jingwu Academy had to learn these 10 forms. And these 10 forms included like all these like high kicks and springing leg and all these kind of things. And they were, for lack of a better term, generic Kung Fu forms. They weren't style specific. And all of the Jingwu trainees learned these 10 forms first. And they're like foundational forms with stances and with kicks and with punches and all this kind of stuff for developing their internal power. Once they learned these 10 forms, then they were allowed to specialize in any of the styles that the different Sifus taught. So they would have a Northern Mantis Sifu and an Eagle Claw Sifu and maybe a Sifu from another style. So it was like you went through basic training of these 10 forms, and then you said, okay, I'm gonna do Eagle Claw. And then you started Eagle Claw. Or you decided to do Praying Mantis, right? But what had happened was Praying Mantis, Northern Praying Mantis, Eagle Claw, those styles, they didn't really have high kicks and all that crazy stuff. But that stuff existed in those 10 fundamental forms. And what ended up happening is all of those martial arts, Northern Mantis, 7-star Mantis, Eagle Claw, they adopted the 10 Jingwu forms into their curriculum. So if you go to like a Northern Mantis school, even in Hong Kong to this day, like the first 10 forms you learn aren't even originally from Northern Mantis. They're essentially foundational busy work before you actually learn that style. And if you go to Eagle Claw, it's the same thing, and it's the same 10 forms. So what happened was all of these traditional martial arts now became 10 forms more bloated with high kicks and all this fancy stuff that aren't originally part of the core style. So that became adopted and commonly accepted, and people don't know this. People think, oh, Tam Toi, which is just a generic leg springing exercise, they're like, oh, that's part of Praying Mantis. It's not. It's a Jingwu form that got absorbed into Praying Mantis and also got absorbed into Eagle Claw. So Wing Chun avoided all of this. And so we don't have all this like extra form bloat, which is why styles that may have traditionally not had high kicks had high kicks because of the Jingwu 10. So that's kind of the idea right there. So I'm going to unmute you guys. If you guys have any questions, we'll go from there, because I realize at some point, I just need to cut myself off. Otherwise I will never stop. All right, one moment here. Okay, so boom. All right, you guys are unmuted. If you want to mute yourself, you can always remute yourself, not a problem. Was that helpful? I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, so
Sifu, is that the same Jingwu from the Jet Li movie?
Yes, very good question. So Ethan asked if that's the same Jingwu from the Jet Li movie. And that shows me how new school you are, because it's actually the same Jingwu from Bruce Lee's Fist of Fury. All right. So here, and I'll mute you guys real quick while I answer this. So Bruce Lee made a movie called Fist of Fury. All right, it was his second film, and although the film is fictitious, it's actually based on the Jingwu Academy. All right, it's loosely based on it, and the story is that the founder of the Jingwu Academy, this guy named Huo Yuanjia in Mandarin, or Fo Yunga, was killed by the Japanese, because the Japanese are always the most treacherous in the old kung fu movies, right? And so Chen Zhen, who is a student of Jingwu, was abroad when the master was killed by the Japanese. And then he comes back to find his Sifu is dead. and it's Sifu, right? And then he goes and he just wreaks havoc on all the Japanese, shows up, beats the stuffing out of all the Japanese, and then that's that story. The funny thing is, the character Chen Zhen, which Bruce Lee plays in that movie, was actually a real life character. But that story isn't real at all. What they did is they looked at the old Jingwu Academy enrollments, and they just looked at all the names, all right, of all the people who trained at Jingwu Academy in the early 1900s, and they looked down and they saw the name Chen Zhen, and they thought, wow, that sounds like a really good name, and they just picked it. Chen Zhen could have been the worst student at Jingwu. He could have been the janitor who just took some lessons for all we know. But they liked that name because Chen is the name Chan, right? And Zhen means true. So it's like a very poetic name, but he could have been the lousiest guy there. And so they took it and they made a fictitious story about a real Kung Fu academy. And then later, Jet Li remade the story in 2 films. The first one was Fist of Legends, where he essentially redid the Bruce Lee movie, but this time with a love story with the Japanese, where he fought Yasuaki Kurata, who we met in Hong Kong together. And so Fist of Legend is essentially a remake of Bruce Lee's Fist of Fury. But then they also made the movie Fearless, and Jet Li plays Fok Yun Gap, who's the head of the Jingwu Academy. So Jet Li has played both the leader of the Jingwu Academy and the student Chen Zhen. He's played both roles in 2 separate movies, right? And so this lore about the Jingwu Academy has been brought up mainly by these 2 films, although none of those stories are actually true. Yeah, I hope that
Wow, amazing. Thank you.
Cool. All right. Any other questions on that stuff? No, everyone is good. Did I just
how many of the 10
the hell
do
out
you
of you
know?
guys? I don't know.
How many
You
of those 10
mentioned-
forms do you know?
Huh?
How many of those forms do you know?
How many of those forms do I know? I don't know any of them, but I can recognize if someone is doing Hamdoi, or Bruce Lee even learned a couple of them. He learned a form called Gonglik Kun, which is, and oddly enough, one of those 10 forms is called Kun. All right, like Jeet Kune Do. So Bruce Lee, I believe Bruce Lee had learned the Jeet Kune form, and that's also where he got the inspiration for the name of his own style. But they're really quite generic. As a matter of fact, you can go on YouTube and look at all those Jingwu forms, and they look really cool, but these are essentially forms that were created in the 20th century as foundational busy work for everyone who joined the Jingwu Academy. Other questions?
You mentioned how these other styles have incorporated these 10 Jingwu forms. Are there any schools that have sort of not absorbed that and just stuck to teaching more traditional stuff?
I see. Yes. So I don't know that. So most of my friends who teach those traditional styles that have incorporated that, they seem to all still teach it, because they actually like the Jingwu 10. They feel that because if you look at all of them, there's one form that does kicks, one form that does punches, one form that does internals, like a generic broadsword form. So they feel that it's kind of, and the sentiment of it isn't bad. It's like you have this very strong physical foundation where you can do all these different punches and kicks, and there's even a form where there's lots of rolls and jumps. So it's almost like you build a Kung Fu athlete with 10 forms. And then they specialize in a style. So in theory, I think it would actually kind of be great if all kids, in school, learn the Jingwu 10 as physical education. Because even if you didn't go into martial arts, the physical background you would have to go into soccer, gymnastics, this, that, whatever, I think is really, really amazing. So I don't have any problem with it in theory. I just think, obviously, if someone wants to learn self-defense, they want to learn how to, someone attacks them, what do? I can't say, all right, hold on, come back in 2 years when you learn these 10 forms, and then I'm going to teach you how to fight. So there's practical problems with saying doing that, right? So but to answer your question, I don't really know anyone who doesn't teach those forms in a style that kind of traditionally had it. Okay, so Alan asked, how were the founders of Wing Chun able to maintain the forms and partner practice largely without expansion over time? was there a formative text that stated rules regarding expansion? Wow, that's a very engineer question right there. Well, Wing Chun is a very straightforward style taught from Sifu to student by hand. The need for teaching it en masse, which is what we do now, is a new thing. If I only had to teach my students one-on-one, I wouldn't need to have curriculum cards and I wouldn't need to have all of these things. Because if my student came to me every day to practice with me for an hour, over the course of 10 years, for sure I've taught them everything I know. But when we have a big group, we have to teach things more systematically. So the fact that Wing Chun was only taught from one teacher to one student meant that they didn't really need to have as systematic a teaching method, because eventually the students stayed for 10 years and they learned it all anyway, all right? So Andrew Lin asked, my internet is slow, but is the emphasis on kicking in Taekwondo related to those high kick forms, especially since Korea is adjacent to North China? So I don't really know the answer to that. Despite the fact that I have a black belt in Taekwondo, I am not the Taekwondo genius when it comes to the history and the background. I do know that Taekwondo, and this is not to say anything about the Koreans, right? But what the Koreans have done is they essentially created their version of all the major Japanese martial arts, okay? So, for example, they have their own version of ninjutsu. It's called Hwarangdo. They have their own version of Chinese Kung Fu called Tang Su Do, which is Tong Sao Do, the Chinese hand. Taekwondo is their version of Japanese karate. And Hapkido, if you look at the characters that they use, is Aikido. So actually what they've done is they've created their own versions of a lot of the popular martial arts. That doesn't mean that they copied and pasted. It means that they took inspiration from it and they did it their own way. I happen to think that Taekwondo kicking is a lot more evolved than karate kicking, but that doesn't mean that it didn't originally get inspired from karate, for example. But as to why it became that way, if you look at original karate, is the Okinawan karate. The Okinawan karate is the closest to Chinese martial arts, because the Chinese martial arts came from Fujian into Okinawa, and then that's where the original karate styles developed. Then Okinawan karate went to Japan, and then when it went to Japan, it expanded into a bunch of different styles, which included high kicks and things. Of course, there are Okinawan styles with high kicks, but if you look at a lot of traditional Okinawan styles, it's waist-level kicks, so it's still pretty old school. So I don't know exactly how that came to be. I would have to find someone who's far more knowledgeable in Korean martial arts than I am. Right? Cool. Any other questions?
Sifu, with these Sifus that were getting hired by the more elite class, do you think that these were remnants or pockets of knowledge that were left over? So if they were fighting as rebels or resisting the Qing government after they were, after they were beaten, and then go into small pockets of resistance, like the triads, or like the. Yes.
No. I hear you. Okay. Let me mute you again. So, So no. Actually, the resistance against the Qing dynasty was in the 1850s. By the late 1800s, people were too worried about this thing to think that they were going to beat the hell out of a gun with Wing Chun, right? So. The resistance against the Qing dynasty really died off by the mid-1800s, all right? Because it was pretty clear Kung Fu ain't beating the government, right? And this is when those underground societies, the Hongmun, eventually became organized crime. Because when they no longer had this reason to fight against the government, what did they do? They became organized crime. All of the modern day triads in Hong Kong trace their lineage to the Shaolin Temple, to the original Hongmun. So organized crime, the mafia of China, is all Shaolin based, but not Shaolin from martial arts, Shaolin from like this, where the founders came from. And so these guys who would have taught in the late 1800s, maybe early 1900s, no, these were just the current generation of people teaching those styles. These were not really Qing rebels anymore. These were just people who knew some Kung Fu. All right, cool. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. I had a lot of fun doing that. Yeah, and I look forward to doing the advanced one tomorrow with you guys. I'm gonna figure out the movie thing for tonight, because I would love to show you guys 8 Diagram Pole Fighter. It's one of my favorites. It's one of the craziest.
My personal favorite. I love it.
Yeah, it's the best. Fest.
Ooh, what time is it gonna be?
I don't know. It'll be a little bit late. Depends on how long it takes me to figure it out. We have a couple events and things today. I don't want to go too long over, but we'll do it maybe a little bit more in the evening when we have some time. All right.
Thank you.
All right, guys. Take care. It was nice to see all you guys.
See you guys in class
All
if
right.
you want to join me.
You guys.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Okay.
Thank you, Sifu.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.